But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on the treacherous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches, have lost support of their bishops and fellow ministers, but they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant.
Do you remember when you went to school and they gave you something to read, but you didn't really know why, and it was sort of a confusing thing and you really didn't have much context for it? Well, that's what happened to me with Letter from Birmingham Jail. It was something that I didn't quite understand when I first picked it up. Didn't really know where it came from. I figure, he just had some things to say, so while he was in jail, he wrote this letter. Well, that's not really true, because there were 8 clergymen who wrote a letter to him, or it was in the paper. I'm not exactly sure how he got a hold of it, but he decided to write a long response, just pointing out some of their misconceptions of what he was doing there. And it's one of my favorites because of his language, the way he uses a moral language to talk to people who he could be using a godly one. They're all preachers, they're all Christians, but yet he chooses to speak in a way that's most prudent and shows great temperance in his way of life and his constant struggle and fight against racial inequality and poverty. So, hey, stick around, and we're going to do a little analyzing of this great work by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thanks for joining me, and hey, take a minute, go hit that like button, that subscribe button, leave me a comment, but this is the kind of thing I do for fun, so if you like this kind of stuff too, please help me out. And come and follow me, James Manning III, just about everywhere you can find me. And hang on, we're going to get into it right after this. Find so interesting about this letter that these 8 white preachers wrote is that it almost completely skips over everything that these protests are about. They almost completely ignore the issues, and they want to call for law and order, but they have no call for integration as the law. So what are these men really saying? And the only way that I could come up with a sort of strategy to dissect this would be kind of a call and response. So one section in that letter says, "We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely." And I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit. "Directed and led in part by outsiders. And we believe this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area." So they're saying, hey, we want people from around here to deal with this. We don't want them to have any help. Is basically what they're saying there. And they're like, they call him an outsider. So this is a direct quote from the letter to Dr. King. It's the first paragraph in this letter. We clergymen are among those who, in January, issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We expressed understanding in honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urged that decisions of those courts should be in the meantime peacefully obeyed. Yeah, so the courts have been working real good, and let's just make sure we stick with that, because you'll never get anywhere in the court, and it'll take a really long time. And we want you to obey the laws in the meantime and quit bothering us, is kind of what they're saying. There's no heart in this letter. It is just like some dismissal. I mean, I wouldn't say it's evil, but it's certainly not righteous. And it is a dismissal of what's happening because they don't want to deal with it or anything to change. There's really nothing in there. They're not saying anything at all. They're just saying, oh, obey the law as it stands, and we don't be doing any of that protesting, even though it's your right guaranteed to you under the Constitution. And they don't like the protests. And the next lines say, we're confronted by these demonstrations, and they're led in part by outsiders. They're referring to Martin Luther King and Abernathy, of course. And they say, we recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. Unwise and untimely? Okay, well, they're untimely, unwise. That sounds like somebody who maybe their business is affected by this and they're just annoyed by it and don't care about racial equality or that people are suffering. They don't care at all. These are preachers. But this is the statement they attach their name to. Now, Dr. King has a beautiful way of responding to these, and I'm not really going to do it justice, but I'm going to bring up a couple of things that I find enjoyable about his responses. He says, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. I don't know, seems like a pretty good reason to me, and it comes from the heart. Not just like my business is, I'm having a little trouble, brr. He says, in letter from Birmingham Jail, I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned with what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Right? This is one of Dr. King's most famous quotes, and it comes from a letter he wrote while he was imprisoned for parading without a permit. And I saw a video, and it looked like while he was walking down the sidewalk, motorcycle cop drove up on the sidewalk and arrested both him and Abernathy. On the sidewalk! And they arrested him for parading without a permit. So this is an example of weaponization of the police to look after the status quo, supported by this letter from the 8 preachers. Dr. King continues, never again can we afford to live in the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives in the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. So he's just saying, I'm not an outsider, even though you want to paint me as one. But I'm here because injustice is here. So it's kind of their own fault. They keep saying that it's unwise and untimely, and that he's some outsider and we don't need you here. And his response, he actually is showing quite amazing amount of prudence and temperance to make his point. And he says here, such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively, in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. To the solid rock of human dignity. It's pretty hard to argue with that. I mean, he's really calling for what he truly believes, and he's not using some gray language to do it. He's really pointing out that this is coming from the heart and something that couldn't be stopped no matter whether he's in jail or not. So another excerpt here from the letter that prompted these 8 clergymen. We expressed understanding that honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urged that decisions of those courts should in the meantime be peacefully obeyed. Okay, well, what he's talking about here, the Supreme Court's decision 1954 outlawing segregation, right? Is this what they're talking? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to the public at large? Or are they saying don't protest? Very strange, but Dr. King says, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, outlawing segregation in public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. One of the things, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is that Dr. King was arrested and put in Birmingham Jail for parading without a permit. And he just wants to express that he does those things out and in the open. And he consciously disobeys an unjust law. And it's not because the law is unjust as you should be able to parade without a permit. He says, no, this is a just law. However, when a just law is used in order to push forward an unjust idea, that is no longer a just law. And I think that is a very true statement. Arresting someone for parading without a permit merely to stop them from demonstrating, this is an incorrect use of law. And he has more to say about law. And it's probably because of this statement here. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. And I don't get it. How much more extreme can you get than bombings, lynchings, murders, unlawful jailing? How extreme do you have to get before extreme measures are justified? It's only the group who's acting that they're making these things. If it was the other way around, they wouldn't be considered extreme at all. And he has more to say about this idea of just and unjust laws. He says, in your statement that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't it like condemning a robbed man because of his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights, because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the rob and punish the robber. Well, that's it. Society must protect the rob and punish the robber. And this is a tremendous way to go about saying that we have been robbed as a people, and the robbers are not being held accountable for their action. He continues, I hope you are able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, with a willingness to accept penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, in reality expressing the highest respect for law. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything that the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that, had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. Well, pretty hard to argue with that. It's true. Everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal because he was in the legal power structure that allowed to say what was legal and what was illegal. So, dang, pretty hard to argue with that. And remember that this is 1963, and wasn't that long ago that Hitler was on the minds of everyone. Here's another openly blatant slap in the face to equality and what these preachers claim that they're a part of, like a rule for common sense. Let's unite in the idea of continuing the status quo exactly as it is. You're bothering us. Here's another quote from the preachers. We commend the community as a whole, and the local news media and the law enforcement in particular, calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement official to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. Okay, you can obviously see the problem with this. We commend the community as a whole, and the local news media and law enforcement in particular. Please. Well, the law enforcement, as Dr. King outlines in detail about what law enforcement was doing to the protesters, attacking them with dogs, beating them with sticks, arresting them en masse. Oh, yeah, we commend the law enforcement and the news coverage. Well, this is one of the great advantages that we have in living in the times that we do. We can look back at what was done in these times. This was 1963, but look at the tools that they're using. They're the exact same tools they're using today to sweep under the rug the problems that we have and make the mass populace who pay attention to the news think that all those protesters are bad and that the news media is giving you the exact right, just the facts, ma'am, kind of deal, kind of reporting that we should be getting, which they're not. It's obviously skewed. And supporting and celebrating the law enforcement officials that really aren't supporting the constitutional rights that we have as Americans to protest. They're being used as a tool to prevent the progress that Dr. King and his congregation, his followers, the people of Birmingham were trying to accomplish, which is nothing more than our inalienable rights given to us by those who founded our country. And he says here, as I completely agree with, of course, well, you know that. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. Some reason you're listening to me. But Dr. King says, I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. It is true that the police have exercised a degree of discipline in handling the demonstrators. In this sense, they have conducted themselves rather non-violently in public. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation? Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I have tried to make clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Perhaps Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather non-violent in public, as was Chief Pritchett in Albany, Georgia, but they have used the moral means of non-violence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. As T.S. Eliot has said, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. Once again, Dr. King is laying the smack down on these guys' futile attempts to make the white population and the power structure in Birmingham, Alabama at the time show the falsities that they're portraying. I mean, it's hard to believe that you could celebrate the police in this time for the immense brutality that they had amongst anybody who joined. This is the exact same thing that happens today. The police are painted like they're angels, and the protesters are painted like robbers. But really, there's a high moral understanding that must happen in there, that people who are protesting have a reason to protest. And the police, of course, we need police to maintain some sort of order and arrest whoever may be molesting whatever. We can't allow that to happen in our society, but we also need to make sure that an arm that is supposed to be used for good in upholding the law, just laws, shouldn't be used in an immoral way to uphold unjust laws under the guise of law and order. From the clergyman, when rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders, not in the streets. See, once again, another statement that's just like, you're annoying, and they have no moral ground, no backup, no reasoning for any of this. But once again, the smackdown comes from Dr. King in saying, you don't like that we got to press it in the courts. Well, the courts haven't been super successful in making local changes. So he's going to say this. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that in this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist. Extremist. Dr. King will not stand for this. So this is one of my favorite things that, it comes from a Christian background, but even non-Christians could understand and see what he's saying here. I quote, "Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? And one of my favorite things he says here, perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, but still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. Boom! This is what I'm talking about. I love this stuff. I mean, you can't get much better of an argument than that. Like, he's quoting from the Bible. He's quoting from Thomas Jefferson. I mean, any preacher couldn't fight that. The only way you could is if you are using some strange mental gymnastics to get you out of believing in these words. And they're words that all of these men should be quite used to hearing, and that ring quite true. And it says nothing about, I'm better than you, just the fact that people are being oppressed, and that those who are not being oppressed can't quite understand what they're seeing, and that they don't have the same feelings towards the oppressed because they don't understand. They couldn't possibly put themselves in their shoes because they're too high and mighty for that. We want to maintain the status quo here. Let's not rock the boat, Dr. King. And in using his moral language, he seems to expect that he could have the participation of the people in the congregations, and he just doesn't seem to get it. Even though he's speaking from a religious-based morality, he doesn't seem to have the support that he thought he would easily expect to get. And I'll quote from a letter from Birmingham Jail again. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. I have heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshippers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law, but I have longed to hear white ministers declare for this degree because integration is morally right. And that's kind of the whole thing. But I have longed to hear white ministers declare, follow this decree because integration is morally right. This is what he wanted. It is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And he uses, sometimes I'm just so floored by his abilities here. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. And he takes the time to go over in a part of his letter from Birmingham Jail to go over what is a just and unjust law. And how does that connect to morality? So he says, now what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. In terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. And down the line he says, thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. And he goes a little while down there. He also says that such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and denies citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you were able to see the distinction that I am trying to point out. And in no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law. You know, I'm kind of talking a lot about law, but one of the things that wasn't recognized is how well that Dr. King was using temperance and prudence, right? Because he decided to wait a little bit longer to do some of these demonstrations because he wanted to make sure that it didn't interfere with the political atmosphere. And yet they still call him untimely. It says, we decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that, except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this would be the best time to bring pressure to bear on the merchants for the needed change. Launching into these things, he was strategically thinking about it, and the economic withdrawal is huge because it causes more understanding. More people have to pay attention because not only are there demonstrations in the streets, but a lot of people are choosing not to buy things, and it affects the way that local elections could happen if you don't time them right. So he showed excellent prudence in the matter to make sure that the right things were coming through and that social, political, and economical questions were being raised. Towards the end of the letter, he starts to point out his convictions and what he truly believes. And it's encompassed in this next statement. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. Whoa. It's like, look, we've been struggling for this same idea for a very long time, and you couldn't stop us then, and you won't stop us now. Continued here. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values of our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And this is where I think he shows great prudence and fortitude and temperance as well. Because he says here, from the letter, if I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth, indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. Even at the end, after he said what he wanted to say, he's still showing humility and love. And that even though he disagrees with what was said in that statement, and that his letter was much too long, but he has nothing better to do than write long letters and pray long prayers. But he still is looking out. He's sort of like saying, hey, I could have made a mistake in here, but I don't believe I did. And even though I don't claim to be a religious man, and I'm certainly not a Baptist, I can stand by what Martin Luther King said. And there's so much that he points out in this letter that kind of calls into question the morality of these clergymen who just want to maintain the status quo, which is pretty much the opposite of what Christians have done through the times, right up till modern. They because of what their beliefs were, they changed the world, the way that things are done. And not always good ways, but in some, and especially prompting this conversation, that what's morally right. And you can take your examples from the Bible, but you can take them from other places too, and just to see that you should be acting on a moral ground, thinking what's good and what's not good, what's right and what's wrong. And we can all agree that regardless of who you are, if you're an American, we are subject to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and those who brought us to the point where we're at. We just got to take some time to look at what we have and be thankful for the potentiality that we have in this country to do great and moral things. And regardless of what religion you are, or whether you have one or not, the words that Dr. King says are still applicable in our lives. And that even though that this was long ago, not that long ago, but long ago, and it's still very important. And for some reason, we're still talking about it, and we still have work to do. But luckily, we have all this great work that's already been done by tremendous people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, I suppose that's it for me. I want to say thank you for sticking around, and I hope that you go and check out this letter for yourself and the call for unity and some of the other things that were happening in Birmingham at the time. And what really made Dr. King write this letter? And if you forgive my turn of phrase, he really laid the smackdown on these guys. If you had to check points, his letter had everything, and their letter had nothing. Sort of like a dry and hateful wishing to maintain the status quo, as opposed to anything that's called progressive, or to do anything to help quell the unrest that's happening by people who really deserved to be treated the same as others under the tenets of our country. But if there's anything that Dr. King is an exemplar of, it's those virtues: temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. Because he showed great temperance in his actions by being the nonviolent person that he was. He showed incredible fortitude by always pushing forward no matter what the danger or where he needed to go. He showed incredible prudence by writing such a wonderful letter in response to those who cared not for him. And, well, nobody's arguing about Dr. King's relentless struggle and dedication to justice. So thanks for listening, and please help me. Hit the like and subscribe. Leave me a comment. I don't care if you just say you suck at reading quotes or anything like, hey, I just need your help. If you like any of this stuff that I'm doing, please help me out, and just let me know. And if there's anything you would like to talk about or something you'd like to hear me cover, please don't hesitate. Mention it in the comments. You can send me an email at info@jm3e.com. And hey, thanks for listening, and celebrate Martin Luther King in your own way. This is how I do it. So thanks. And thanks for listening to History and Whatevea. And I'm your host, James Manning III. Talk to you next time.